But we hear those things as little isolated events that are sort of quirky. But evidently there must be a whole culture behind the scenes where, like, they described like dinner meetings where they would get together sort of quietly and not say until they all got together, and they'd say, what are you hearing? What's going on with this? What do I know? So there's this keen interest in this topic by government officials, and I found that very, very intriguing, and I suspect this is only the tip of the iceberg of what's going on in this. Can you elaborate further, Pastor Chris?
Well, not much really other than what you've already said. I think, whether or not there's a reality of this material to be disclosed, one of the points that was made by Stephen Bassett that is that the disclosure of the information will have a tremendous influence on civilization as we know it. And whether it's factual or whether it's some kind of deception, or regardless of what it is, if someone were to come and say, we have this, it's going to change everyone's perspective. So I think that's pretty much what he was getting at with his presentation. And of course, I think he's a political activist, if I'm not mistaken, from up in the D.C. area, and strongly pressuring the United States to do what other governments have already done, to declassify a lot of their information. And it's on the news. It's not like we're telling you anything new. I mean, this is common knowledge.
Yeah, one thing that Mr. Bassett talked about that I found interesting, he was a very interesting speaker with a lot of information, was that he talked about what he sees, and for other people he's talked to, what the impact on different world religions will be. And I was a little surprised for him to say not only were, like, for example, he said Hinduism, Buddhism, they're used to integrating stuff, pulling other new stuff in and sort of merging it in. They probably won't have much of a problem with it. But he said that even he thought evangelical Christianity and fundamentalists of Christianity would be able to deal with it. They would handle it better than what people might think. But the one group he said that he thought would offer the most resistance would be Islam, because they would think that since Western governments are thought to be the ones who have this information to the largest extent, that it would seem to be like as a trick or some unbalance of power, or an unbalance of power, and that they anticipate that'd be an issue. It was an interesting discussion, but they talked about the financial situation we have right now and how this was a factor in what was disclosed, just the big balance between the East and West and what that was doing. But that was a big thing that they were focusing on. He even talked quite a bit about one of the Rockefellers involved with the Clintons, and there was some big meeting that was covered, pictures taken, everything about this, where he actually billions of dollars were at their disposal to be able to try to disclose this information. And they said different candidates had different levels of discomfort in talking about this topic, and Hillary Clinton was one person that they really had pushed quite a bit about that.
Can I just say about Stephen Bassett that Dr. Future and I actually interacted with him probably the most, and one of the things that I liked about him, he came out at the beginning of his presentation and said, "Okay, I am not a psychic. I have no spiritual powers. I'm pretty much a lobbyist and I guess a sort of a reporter." And when he gave his presentation, of course, he was using PowerPoint, and he had images of PDFs, files, of documents and the photos. So I just want to clarify that for your listeners, that when Dr. Future is sitting here talking about the photos being taken and that he had he displayed those photos, so you could see what he was talking about. So he was very interesting. To listen to, and I guess because he said he didn't really have any spiritual interest in the matter, we were able to actually talk to him a little bit more. And one of the things that I brought up with him was the whole concept of human nature and original sin, that how that's going to play into any kind of change in world scenario, that people are people, and we're going to act the same way we always have. Unless God does a change in our lives, we're going to respond the way we've always responded to things.
Okay. If I could just mention a little addendum, because we need to move on here, coming close. He said that we'd be hearing a lot more of this in the news, and Pastor Chris, I unloaded some stories to cover for our regular Friday news segment on the show, and one of the stories from the Washington Post is about religions must prepare for ET discovery. And it's all a talk about how the different world religions now are getting ready to get this information as a Washington Post and have to deal with it.
What was the date on that?
This was Sunday, July 20th. So maybe they know a little bit about what they're talking about, at least as far as the expectation to push it in the news.
There you
is
have
that
it.
we may have seen some stuff that we'll anticipate hearing more about in the future.
Stephen Bassett. Do you guys want to talk about her talks a little bit, or?
Yeah, I think just to
I'd
give
like to hear his perspective on
sort of cleanse the palate, try something a little different here. Just to give you another perspective, we're not going to talk about everybody there, and we only got exposure a couple days, people, so we can't really give you a total snapshot. But James Hurtak was a gentleman whose name came up actually in my own research as a channeler, and he was a channeler of some group called the Council of Nine, who, this is just in my own research that I'd done, that supposedly these were entities that were channeled by a number of people, including Uri Geller, who was the channel before him, the Israeli psychic.
Yeah, I've
and
heard that
then
name before.
Dr. Hurtak became involved. I don't know the man personally or much detail about it, to be honest with you, but these were supposedly the 9 major gods of ancient Egypt that were coming back and talking again. Well, anyway, he's known for a number of things. He wrote a book called The Pillars of Enoch, or Keys of Enoch, excuse me, and he spoke with his wife. I think they speak together quite a bit in different groups, and I didn't catch everything of the very beginning of his talk, but I got an audio copy of it that I'm going to be reviewing. But their talk was a mix of sort of Kabbalah-type talk about the tree of life and a merging of different kind of mystical concepts like that. And then they had a time of music where they began singing together. And it was sort of audience participation where they worked in certain words for everybody to sing in. And they even had a visual kind of thing they put on the screen where it was like this spinning image that kept spinning and morphing and things as they were singing. It was a very interesting kind of multimedia thing that they did. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Pastor.
It was just it was a kind of a I hesitate to use the word shamanistic, but it was a sort of a group consciousness kind of event where people were kind of meditating and that together, and it was pretty interesting. Dr. Future and I abstained from the activity.
You didn't dance? No dancing for y'all?
We did observe.
It's like not knowing the hokey pokey, we would have put our right foot in. But I don't mean to make light of those participants, but the thing that was to me was interesting about that was I even saw some similarities, I have to admit, between some of the techniques they used to get people's involvement and some churches I've been in. And that was a thought that went through my head. Not the same words or things like that, but as far as the physical techniques used to develop certain emotional states or develop certain things, certain churches have done that and have had tangible physical results from it. I don't know if they know that those techniques are used beyond churches in those aspects. And I think people understand where I'm going with that.
Sort of like mood music and lighting and that kind of thing.
Well, or even things to get people in a fevered pitch and to breathe. You can take almost any message and get a certain response out of people with the right mixture of things. And I'm not trying to slam on the Hurtaks or anything. There was I'm sure many other people using different techniques. It was all according to what they wanted to achieve. I'm just saying it reminded me of some of the kind of techniques I've seen in some churches sometimes.
Wow.
And it was interesting hearing information that was not your typical churchy kind of information where those techniques were being applied and how it had a similar response to people.
It must have made it very...
I'll leave it at that. But
Let's do that.
Okay.
We also talked a little bit here before we got on the air about Dr. Stephen Greer.
Yeah, I think we talked about him a little bit. I don't really have that much more elaborate because he basically was the one who has real access to people, insider people in Washington, but he also takes individuals out and to actually conjure ETs. He uses laser lights and shines them in the air, and people all stood up and said, hey, we've been part of these groups, and we see ETs coming up here and things like that. Now, he didn't show photos or any of that kind of stuff to see, so, there wasn't any other kind of corroborative information to show, but he's a well-known guy. He's a guy you'll see frequently on Coast to Coast, and he's very, very influential. And he was almost sort of a little bit of a folk hero there, I could tell. He was one of the keynote speakers, very charismatic kind of guy. And a real leader in it, and he is committed, it appears, to bringing about something, and it involves ETs as a big part of it, and a consciousness transformation, and going one political figure at a time through and getting them on board. Is basically it. I think that probably gives you a pretty good feel of the people of the conference, and really just comes back to digesting what the significance of it is.
Wow. Well, let's shift gears here once again. One of the things I'd love to hear from you guys about, why do you both think a community of people in this nature has evolved kind of like this?
I think we've touched on that a little bit already. I think there have been people who have a spiritual void in their lives. They have an interest in spiritual things, but they haven't found it in maybe their church or religious experience that they've been in. I heard an evangelist years ago who said, "Don't ever make the mistake of thinking that your neighbor is not interested in spiritual things, or that you're more interested in spiritual things than he is." People are very interested in spiritual things, and they will go to where they find they can get some kind of a fulfillment there. I think some of the people that we met experienced legitimate disappointment, like we mentioned. I think some people are just, it's human nature for us to not want to listen to authority, whether it be a priest or a pastor or a teacher or
that's
God,
my nature,
or
most
God,
of the time.
I think a lot of us can relate to that.
Yeah.
But the truth is, people we love our sin. Humans in general, we do, and people, we love to follow our desires. Sometimes it may be sensual lusts or materialism. It can be a type of spiritual pride or empowerment that somebody finds. When they get into this. Years ago, before I was a pastor, I ran around with a lot of people. I was a musician, and I met. In the late 70s, I hung with a lot of people that were into some very interesting and different beliefs, and I met people who were took a great deal of pride in feeling like they had some kind of spiritual power over people or spiritual influence over others. Like if you remember in Acts chapter 8, I think it is, Simon the Magi, who the people esteemed him to be some great one, and he had influence over the people. He had spiritual influence over them. Well, if somebody thinks you have spiritual truth and they come to you because you have the answers or you can guide them, I think it's a very heady experience for a lot of people to want to get into something like this so they can influence others. I mean, there's probably 1,000 reasons why a community has evolved like this, but I think it's essentially a search for God. It's really a search for the God who created us, and looking in the wrong places. You want to add to that, Dr. Future?
No. I think, I know our time's getting short here, but I'd like to just comment about how I think that this movement may impact the church in the world, just looking, since I am Dr. Future, looking at the future of it. To me, this movement seems to be growing. We only saw as a microcosm of more of the leadership. This conference normally has about 500 people that make the effort. They said they were down to about 300 at this time. But there were a subset that are sent, sort of like messengers. This is a group. If you really want to know how big this whole thing is, watch regular TV. Watch how teachings of this whole nature, they're pervasive throughout Star Wars. They're pervasive throughout most of our movies that we have, our TV shows. That is more a common, the teaching that we heard there was more common with the common culture. I think they've been successful, I guess is what I'm saying, in pervading our culture, whereas the traditional kind of Christianity, including the whole concepts of fallen man and atonement and all that, has really fallen out of favor with the culture. And so they've really, this is something that they've succeeded in pervading it, sometimes more subtly than others, and it's become the accepted talk in there. Even though we found some of the older people that were there, but beyond the media, even the whole environmental movement. This is something that found, they talked a lot about Gaia and Mother Earth and things like this, and that fit in very, very well with the current environmental movement right now, and dovetails with that. And of course, even the UN endorsement. I think most of the things regarding unity, unity and adopting people of all positions and faiths is in line with the UN Charter. And that's why I assume the UN is a part of it. Although it's very curious, I don't know all of what the UN's motives or why they get into this. I normally think of the UN in preventing wars and stopping famine. Yeah. But they have a big spiritual component to their concerns.
Yeah, I've wondered that as well. What is the UN?
And there's a lot of other books and things I've seen on, and I think a lot of these talks and things happen more in their European office in Vienna. More of that happens in the Vienna World United Nations meeting than in the New York. But they have separate meditation rooms and things. Wow. They acknowledge the spiritual component to the success of what they're doing.